unmute them. Over to you, Sinsen.
Oh, all right. So are we ready to accept people in?
Yeah, I just admitted everybody.
All right, okay.
Oh, hey, Pete.
Hello, everybody.
I saved you a stage.
Oh, thank you.
Hi. Okay, so are we ready to start? Bante Joe?
Yes.
All right,
Go for it.
so everyone, please welcome to our Wednesday night wisdom series. My name is Sin here, and we have Bante Joe again. And literally, Bante Joe is about halfway through his tour in Australia. Time flies, right?
Yes.
And there's a few more sessions next week. And in fact, I've just learned there are two new events that have not been announced yet. So I'm going to make that announcement at the end of the session tonight. So welcome and good evening, good afternoon and good morning, everybody. First of all, I'd like to pay respect to the triple gems, the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, and I'd like to also acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians of the land. Where I am today is Wadu Medical Country. I'd like to pay respect to Aboriginal elders, past, present, and emerging. So again, Bante Joe, I'd like to just read your bio briefly before we start.
Sure.
So Bante Joe was born in 1983 in London, Ontario, and was initially interested in business and computers. A spiritual vocation seemed extremely unlikely. However, in high school, he was given a book as a joke, apparently, which contained teachings from assortment of religions. Browsing through it, he came to a description of the Four Noble Truths and was instantly converted. In high school and university, Bante attended the Toronto Zen Buddhist temple. He eventually moved in and started training part-time to become a priest. And in 2006, he took up full training at the temple. However, later on, an attraction to Theravada Buddhism pulled him towards the Thai forest tradition, and he finally ordained in 2010 as a bhikkhu, or a fully ordained monk, with Ajahn Viradhamma as his preceptor. And Bante also lived in Thailand, and his teacher released him in 2015 from dependence. He spent 6 months at a monastery in California, and before returning to Toronto, Canada, before returning to Toronto, Canada between 2016 and 2019. And in Toronto, Bante associated with the Toronto Mahavihara and the West End Buddhist Temple. And right now, Bante is residing in Sri Lanka. And he's been residing in Sri Lanka since 2019. Okay. So tonight, Bante Joe will be talking on the topic of Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, similarities, differences, and the disappearance of Buddhism in ancient India, which I believe is like a sequel to one of the first talks that you gave, Bante, right, at the Buddhist library.
Yes.
You were talking about Sri Lanka, and now it's about India. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to you, Bante. Would you like to lead some meditation first?
Sure.
Then it'll be followed by your talk. And then after that, we'll have Q&A session moderated by Bharath.
Okay. So we can start with a little bit of meditation. So,
I would say so, but many people will disagree.
yeah, it's fine.
Can you see on the camera? Can you be seen on the camera?
Yes.
Yeah. It's all good.
Much better.
Can somebody press record, please, on Zoom? Is it recording, Tina?
Oh, there you go.
I'm doing it.
Recording in progress.
Oh,
Thank you.
all set. Okay, guys, so we can start with a little bit of meditation. So it'll just be a breath meditation. I guess most of the people here actually know how to meditate. Hopefully the people who are on the course know how to meditate, know how to at least do the 10-minute one. So we can just lean forward a little bit and arch our spine and look about 3 feet in front and close our eyes. And can focus in on the breath. can know when it's coming in, and know when it's going out. If we breathe in a long breath, can just know I'm breathing in a long breath. And if we breathe in a short breath, can just know I'm breathing in a short breath. And can focus in on the breath at the tip of the nose. And when watching the breath at the tip of the nose, can try to make the mind a bit like a post in the sea. And the water comes up over the post, onto the beach, and recedes back down into the sea. But the post remains where it is. And in a similar way, can let the mind be still. Watching the breath as it comes in. And watching the breath as it goes out. Let go. Let go of what happened in the past. And let go of your worries about the future. Just allow the body to relax. And the mind to calm down. And can just pose the question in the mind. What would be a really comfortable way to breathe right now? And then just let the body respond on its own. And before we finish meditating, you can spread thoughts of goodwill. Wishing may all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. May they put themselves in a position where they can put the causes into place to be happy and at ease. And we can make the mind infinite. Can make it unbounded. All the way to the ends of the universe and beyond. In every dimension. May all beings all around everywhere be happy and at ease. And can open our eyes and I usually say do a short reflection on the Dhamma, but in this case it will be a long talk on history. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So welcome everybody. And today we're going to discuss a topic which I find interesting anyways. The very first time we did a history talk here, it was for Sri Lankan Buddhism. And there's one other guy. And I was like, are you a history buff? And he said, yes, I'm a history buff. And so am I. So we started talking about history. So history is very interesting because it has the tendency to repeat itself. And it shows a lot about human psychology. Now, the future is always uncertain. You can speculate about it, but you can look back in history and see certain patterns. And they actually reappear in Buddhist history as well. So for those of you who came to our session on Sri Lankan history, you may notice some similar patterns that happen in Indian history. But Indian history, of course, is where it all came from. So the title of the talk is Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta, similarities, differences, and the disappearance of Buddhism in India. And when I first thought about doing this talk, I actually had the idea, I'd heard many things about Advaita Vedanta, and I'd met people who are Advaita Vedantins, and I'd gone to India. And I'd heard many things about how Advaita Vedanta had greatly influenced the fall of Buddhism in India. But actually researching this topic, what I found was that Advaita Vedanta and its relationship with Buddhism is a significant portion, it seems, of the reasons why Buddhism fell. But actually, the reasons why Buddhism fell are within the development of Buddhism itself. Another reason is that it was invaded by some very serious Turks at the time who were taking up a kind of a very fanatical expansion of Islam. So these three things together came to end Buddhism in India. However, the basis of it was the way that Buddhism developed. And the way that Buddhism developed, as it turns out, influenced Hinduism to a profound degree. At least that's what it seems like. So we're going to go through and discuss that a bit. And you may see some of the patterns and discuss some of the ways that's actually influenced the way in which we perceive the practice of Buddhism, how we're going to practice, and the results that we're going to get today. It's all a pretty interesting intertwining. So to do this, we have to jump back to just after the Buddha's Parinibbana, basically. Just after the Buddha's Parinibbana, there happened in India what was called the first of a series, or it was the second council, but may or may not have been the first of a series of what they call schisms, or splits in the Sangha. So when the Sangha is unified, when everybody knows the doctrine, one of the reasons for the Sangha being unified is that everybody has the same view. When the Sangha is unified, everybody has the same view. It presents these excellent opportunities to practice. And about 100 years after the Buddha's death, there came to be what's called the Second Council, which was one of the biggest fights in Buddhism to date. It's kind of a funny story. What had happened was there was a monk who was wandering. He was from the newer established portions of Buddhism, the Western portions of Buddhism. The original area of Buddhism was in the Middle Gangetic Plain, around like Vesali and Rajagaha. And he wandered to this area and went to Vesali. And in Vesali, he went to stay at a particular monastery, and the monks met him and greeted him, and they all sat down, and the lay people came out, and they put a jar in the center of the room and said, now bring the kahapanas. So kahapanas means money. That was a coin. So they put this water in this pot, and then the monks brought the lay people brought this money and put it in this jar. And then the lay people left, and the monks took the water out and threw the money on the ground. They divvied it all up, and they wanted to give this monk a share. But the monk's like, I'm not taking a share. So for that, there's actually these different Vinaya procedures that you can perform on your fellow monks. And one of them is that if a monk insults a layperson, you can force him to go and reconcile with the layperson, if you get the whole Sangha together. So the whole Sangha got together, and they forced this monk, said, you got to go apologize to the lay people for not accepting money. And this monk was quite smart, so he's like, okay, I'm entitled to have a companion, get a companion to go with me. So he gets a companion, they go to the lay people, and he recites all these verses from the Buddha about why monks shouldn't accept money. So then the lay people start thinking to themselves, oh, this new monk is good, our monks are bad. So then they got even more angry with him. So they took him back, and I think they wanted to do something even worse, which is called suspension. You can actually suspend monks. You can perform serious disciplinary transactions on them. And there's no judge. It's just if the Sangha decides to do it. However, if it's not in line with the Dhamma, it's considered invalid. So one of the tricks to get out of that is if you get up from your seat, then the whole thing gets canceled. You have to stay in your seat, and there's rules to prevent you from getting up from your seat. But if you think it's not worth it, you can get up and leave, and the whole thing gets canceled. If they do it while you're sitting in what's called hatapasa, you get the penalty. So this monk had some psychic powers at his disposal, so he flew up in the air and flew out of the monastery, and he went to the Western lands, to where these other good monks were. And the good monks, when they first saw him coming, they're like, oh, this seems like trouble. We don't want to get involved. It's going to disturb our meditation. So they ran away, went to another monastery. And so they followed these good monks and finally caught up with this monk who was the leader. They wanted to settle the dispute and finally convinced him to do it. To make a long story short, they all get together in Vesali and convene what's called the Second Council, which had 700 monks. And this council was focused on all these kind of bad practices that these monks in Vesali were doing that were against the Vinaya. So I won't go through them all, but basically what happened was these elders from the Western portion, the new portions of Buddhism, were able to win. They were able to beat these Vesali monks, and everybody agreed they were wrong, and that should have been the end of the matter. But apparently these Vesali monks got a little bit bitter about that. And what developed in these regions, actually some of the original regions of Buddhism after this, was that they started to continue on with developing the doctrine. And there was a monk who came along named Mahadeva, and he came up with this really unusual doctrine, which was that arahants could be seduced by women, that they could fall from their attainment of arahantship, and there was a bunch of other ones which basically lowered the status of the arahant. So these other monks didn't agree with that. They're like, this is not true. They had other ones that are kind of true, that arahants could be ignorant of some things, which is true. But these other monks didn't agree with that, so this ended up in a fight, and that fight ended up in the first schism. We don't know if it happened right after this Vesali affair, where these monks from Vesali were doing all this bad stuff and didn't like that they've gotten beaten, or it happened about 50 years later, which seems more likely, but it seems like it may have been connected with this very first fight. So the monks who thought that arahants could fall away and these kind of things, they were in the majority, so they got called the Mahasangikas. The other monks got called the Sthaviras. Sthavira means Terra in, I think, Sanskrit possibly. Mahasangikas because they were the majority. So this started a chain of what would eventually become a trend in Indian Buddhism, which was the continuing division and fissuring of the Sangha. So to talk about this trend, first we've got to talk a little bit about the underlying causes that led to the development of Buddhism. Because we were chatting in the car on the way over. So one of the interesting things, if you take a religion, take it out of its culture, stick it in a new culture, the new culture that it goes to, it's usually much more serious and much more conservative. In the culture where the religion developed, it tends to continue developing. It tends to continue changing. So they notice this with Hinduism in Guyana, and it also occurs with Buddhism. If you take Buddhism away from its root culture, stick it in a new one, it becomes much more conservative. So actually, the Theravada Buddhism that went to Sri Lanka, they did make some new doctrines, but they never rewrote the sutras. In India, they eventually ended up rewriting the sutras. So this is why we actually know pretty well what the Buddha taught, because they were very conservative. So the way that Buddhism actually started was there were these schools of what they called samanas. They had these movements of people who left home and they wanted to find answers to different things. So you might call them philosophers. Now, at that time, India was ruled by different kings, different warlords, and they were like the intelligentsia, the smart people in India. And these people got really interested in the philosophies of these samanas. So what you had was rich people wanting to listen to philosophies and different schools of philosophy competing with each other. Now, if this situation rings a bell to anybody who studied economics, it's almost the same situation that you have in capitalism that leads to the formation of new businesses. Ideally, you've got people voting with money, and these samana schools were not all influenced by money. Some of them were pretty sincere spiritually. They just overlap. And then you've got people competing in an atmosphere where they have to develop new products that people will then vote on and accept or not accept. This was the situation that existed in India spiritually. It's what led to the development of Buddhism, led to the development basically of Jainism, led to the development of a lot of the religions that exist in India. And this development continued on in India after the Buddha's passing. So what we see happening after the Buddha's passing is there's a schism over these doctrines, and then they started to construct new doctrines. So this is what you might call the first phase of tipping. It kind of can be roughly divided into three phases. The first phase of tipping and the development of new doctrines. By the way, when I was researching Sri Lankan Buddhist history, it's kind of this history where like the kings fight with each other and there's these big clashes. Indian Buddhist history is like this history of people developing new ideas. So you're kind of going through, okay, he thought this and he thought that and he thought that, and that's how Buddhism changed there. So one of the very first tipping points that came after the time of the Buddha away from his doctrine was the development of what we call the Abhidhammas. And you remember, we had the first split. You got the Mahasangikas, you got the Sthaviras. It was more on the Sthavira side, but actually the Mahasangikas, they also developed the Abhidhammas too. They started developing what they call these Abhidhammas. So inside of the Buddhist texts, you have like some very oblique references, oblique sutras that say, you've got somebody who is basically an arahant. They'd sometimes use conventional language, but they're not attached to conventional language. They say these kind of things. So they took that and ran with it, and they thought part of the sutras are talking about ultimate reality, part of the sutras are just talking about conventions. And they started writing down all this stuff that they thought was ultimate reality, or they thought was conventions. And on this basis, there ended up eventually being 18 different Theravada Buddhist schools. The only one we have a complete Abhidhamma for is the one that I'm a part of, which is what we call Theravada. Its original name may have been Vibhajavada or Theravada. So from this split, you've got these different Abhidhammas that start getting written. They were trying to find out what ultimate reality was, and you can imagine they're writing this down. Kings are watching, supporters are watching, they're having debates. This debate was another part of Indian Buddhist culture, and the part of the way it developed. You'd have these philosophers come together, and sometimes public debates, sometimes they'd write them down, and this was basically how the competition came forward. And the kings or whoever the intelligent people were, they'd read them and evaluate them, and give them money to the one that they liked. So it started developing in terms of what's ultimate and what's not. But what was going to happen soon was actually a development that would affect Theravada Buddhism right up to the present day. And that would eventually form the seeds for its defeat, in part, in India. So this development was actually a schism that occurred inside the Theravada camp. And what they found was there's these references in the suttas that say, okay, some people are like this, some people are like that. And there's also a reference in the suttas which says the self is its own mainstay. So this argument broke out. Wait, when the Buddha talks about a person, is it an ultimate reality or not? There's one group of monks who said it's an ultimate reality. There's really a person behind there. And if there was no person, how are you going to get the effects of kamma? You're not going to be able to receive them. There's another group, which is the group that I'm now part of, that said there's nothing. Said there's no self. And this is actually a doctrine that is carried forward and kept today, that there is no self. And it's a doctrine that would develop further. So this group, they were called the Pudgalavadins. They believed there was a self. The other one, the Sthaviravadins, they believed there's no self. This was one of the first schisms, and this would develop further on. On the side of the Mahasangikas, they had another schism, and they started believing, okay, the Buddha is actually a transcendent being. He's not just a normal human. So it started developing this way. So eventually you've got 18 different Buddhist schools with different Abhidhammas, and you have, some of them are part of this Mahasangika, and some of them are part of this Sthaviravada. But there was another development that was going to occur soon. So about the 1st century CE, they started to arise what's called the Mahaprajnaparamita literature. And this was the beginning of what we might call Mahayana. It built on the trend that was in the Mahasangika, that, okay, the Buddha is just a transcendent being, and it took it a step further. So the very first Mahayana Sutra, what it says is that basically, first of all, they took the Arahants and it pushed them down further. It said, Arahants are selfish. they're going their own way. And who's really compassionate are the Buddhas. The Buddhas have this compassion. And basically, everybody should be a Buddha. But it went even further than that doctrinally. And it said, look, what underlies the basis of all Buddhas is emptiness. So this is like a development on this idea that there's no self. What underlies the basis of all Buddhas and all reality is emptiness. And if you know what emptiness is, then you can start to do what's called upaya, or skillful means. And what this means is you can start to break the precepts for the greater good. So there's all these Jataka stories where the Buddha goes through, like in his past lives in the canon, and he makes mistakes. Like he'll do stuff, he makes mistakes, he even goes to hell. So the perception of the Buddha started to change to the point where it's like he didn't actually make a mistake. What actually happened, he was doing it intentionally out of compassion. And he was breaking these precepts as a skillful means. So now you can break the precepts as a skillful means, and it shows how compassionate you are. So that would have some pretty serious consequences in Japan in World War II, by the way. And you can guess where these kind of doctrines about, killing or lying or stealing for the greater good would go. But this was one of the first introductions in the first sutra of the Mahayana canon. There's this concept of skillful means tied up with the concept of emptiness. Now, this goes a bit further. As you can see, the wheels keep turning in India and things keep developing. And this is just a little interesting fact for people. It started to develop in another direction as well, where it said everybody can be a bodhisattva, but there's a difference between monks and lay people in the way they follow the bodhisattva path. This was another sutta called the Ratanarangsi Sutta. You don't have to remember the name. And so what it said was, basically a lay person's path is totally different than a monk's. Monks got to go to the forest. Lay people don't have to do that. So actually I still remember when I first came to Buddhism, there was all this talk about like the lay person's path versus the monk's path. But in reality, there's one path. It's the Noble Eightfold Path. But this was an introduction that started in the early years of the Christian era, Common Era, And it started from these principles. It's kind of like Mahayana new sutras that were coming out. Another one came out that was further, called the Vimalakirti Sutta, in which Sariputta started to look really, really stupid compared to a layperson. That's kind of the way that these things develop. So this is a man called Vimalakirti, and he's debating with Sariputta, and Sariputta looks really dumb. He doesn't know anything. So this development is going in a particular direction of basically pandering to lay people. So you can see that there's this competition for resources. Kings are given money, and they're developing these doctrines. You need money. This is one way it can go. It also went in another way, in that Mahayana Buddhism, these doctrines started to get more and more what they called idealist. They started to think that the world is not real. So they had this sutta called the Lankavatara Sutta, which introduced this concept of a home consciousness, and that basically the world is consciousness and nothing else is real. So I'm not going to keep talking about philosophy too much, but actually this is the history of Indian Buddhism. So this would lead to a development which would profoundly influence Hinduism. So about the 4th century AD, they had this, two brothers came up, and they came up with a school of Buddhism that was called Yogacara Buddhism. And it took this trend that had started in the Mahasangikas of the Buddha's, transcendent being, then the world isn't real, the world is an illusion, and they took it and said, all you've got is consciousness. Consciousness is the whole world. There's nothing other than consciousness. And they had this idea that actually there was the distinction between an object and a subject was just an illusion. It's all consciousness. And they gave this example of how if you're dreaming, you can dream of objects, but actually it's all just a dream. So there was, about a couple centuries after that, a school arose in Hinduism called Advaita Vedanta. So this school in Hinduism was quite interesting. And we know that it arose about this time because there was a Buddhist philosopher about the 5th century, came after these Yogacharans, and he listed all the major religions in India. Advaita Vedanta wasn't one of them. So not long after that, there was this Hindu monk called Gaudapada, and he wrote this book on what he called the Advaita Vedanta. It's called the Gaudapadiya-karika. And this book, the Gaudapadiya-karika, it takes so much from the Yogacharans. The Yogacharans say that actually all there is consciousness, outside things are illusion. The Gaudapadiya-karika says everything is Brahman, outside things are an illusion. And it actually takes the argument about dream states and waking states. At the same time, a bit earlier, there was another Buddhist philosopher who came around named Nagarjuna, who developed this school called the Madhyamaka. And Nagarjuna had this kind of way of using logic to deconstruct reality. And he would take a person's position, then he would show how absurd it was, and his point of doing that was to show that all views are empty of inherent existence. And one of the arguments that he had was that if you've got a view, it means you have to have a concept. And if you have a concept, it means that you think there's a self. So he's saying that all views point to self. Now this Gaudapadiya-karika, it took that view and it applied it to the Brahman. It said, all views imply a self, so that means there's a Brahman. So what we have here is this school that's arisen in Hinduism. Its foundational text has taken almost entirely from Nagarjuna, the Mahayana, and from the Yogacaras, which developed when Buddhism started to tip from focusing on what was happening inside to what was really real outside. And this would have some pretty fateful consequences. So Gaudapada had a disciple named Govindapada. And Govindapada had a disciple named Adi Shankara. And Adi Shankara would come to be known as one of the greatest thinkers in Hinduism because he kind of restored Hinduism to its pristine glory in the face of the threat of Buddhism. So one of the interesting things about Indian history is that actually from the time of Ashoka up until this time, Buddhism was actually the dominant religion in India. It was the main thing. The king supported it, everything like that. By the time the British came to India, they thought that the Buddha was like a sun god. They didn't even think the Buddha was real, and they thought King Ashoka was a myth. So there's ways that this evolved, and actually one of them was through Adi Shankara. So Adi Shankara was born, and there's this legend about him that his parents prayed for a son. They were very old, they couldn't get a son. And Shiva came to them and said, okay, you've got two choices. You can have a son who lives a long time and he's really, really dumb, or you can have a son who lives a really short time and he's really smart. So they chose the short, smart one. So Adi Shankara was born, and he wanted to be a sannyasin, or a Hindu wanderer, but his mother wouldn't let him, I think because his father died. So there's this story that he got attacked by a crocodile in a lake, and he told his mother, "You've got to let me become a sannyasin, otherwise I'm going to get eaten by this crocodile." So she gave permission, and the crocodile let him go. So from that time, he started to wander. He was 16 at that time, and he came across this monk, or this Hindu monk, Govindapada, who was a disciple of the monk who wrote this book based on Buddhism. And from this, he spent a few years learning the doctrines of Advaita Vedanta. Now, what Advaita Vedanta teaches is that the whole world is actually illusion. The only thing that's real is the Brahman, or the self. And that you can basically access this Brahman or self, is basically your awareness. And so they and these kind of mind-only school of Buddhism, they describe this state where it's kind of your mind is kind of like not leaning forward or backwards or so. And from that, you have an apprehension of what Nibbana is. In other words, your awareness, if you're watching nature, that's Nibbana, more or less. That's the ultimate reality. So Adi Shankara, he took this teachings from his teacher, and he started wandering, but he had a mission. Because if anybody's ever studied Hinduism, it has really, really different doctrines, like totally different doctrines sometimes, like really like different religions and completely different practices, although they're all under the umbrella of Hinduism. So Hinduism had become very fragmented and was kind of like secondary almost, you could say, possibly to Buddhism. So what Adi Shankara did, he took this doctrine, everything's the Brahman, everything's the Brahman, everything else is an illusion, and he used that to unite all the various doctrines of Hinduism. Because you can access this true knowledge or this true Brahman through various forms. So he used the various philosophies of Hinduism and united them with this idea that actually they were all just pointing to this timeless Brahman, this timeless awareness. And that is why it's called Vedanta. It's the end of the Vedas. By the way, this doctrine in Yogacara Buddhism, which says that the perceiver and the perceived, there's no difference, it's called Advyaya. The other one is called Advaita. You see a similarity here? So Adi Shankara started wandering, and he reformed the rituals of Hinduism, but he also started to debate. And he was this very, very brilliant debater. And he debated both with Hindus, but also with a lot of Buddhists. And where he started to debate the Buddhists was on this doctrine of no self. So he said, you're saying the whole world is just these little tiny moments and made up of moments, then how do you have memory? How do you have memory if it's just one moment to the next? What carries over there? And he says, how do you even have cause and effect if you've got these discrete moments? How does one moment affect the next if there's no kind of connection between them? And he had a whole bunch of other ones. I won't go into it because it kind of made me cross-eyed trying to read some of these philosophies. But you get the point. In these debates, it didn't necessarily matter like how strong your philosophical position was, although it did. The winners of the debates were often chosen, you can imagine, when their opponent was silenced. So if you were a brilliant debater, you could come up with a counterposition such that your opponent couldn't answer it. Doesn't mean that it's true. Actually, it's not like a scientific research paper where you're writing it down and then people are poring over it and examining evidence. It's a one-to-one debate, and sometimes they were high stakes. If you win, you convert with all of your disciples to my religion. If I win, I convert with all of mine to yours. So Adi Shankara, he was one of the most brilliant minds of his day, and he defeated many, many Buddhists, and he united Hinduism. And as a result, he's regarded in Advaita Vedanta as the defeater, the destroyer of Buddhism in India. So I just want to jump in here because there's one really interesting thing about the way that we perceive Indian religions and the way that their development actually goes. So there's often this perception that, okay, we're all one, everything is one religion. When you look at the history of the way that these concepts developed and the way that Indian religions competed, it was ruthless. Like, it was a ruthless competition. And the way that they compete in India and Southeast Asia in their religions is not like a Western research paper. They take as much as they can from their competitors, and then they change it slightly, and they attack their competitors. So I remember I went to this one monastery in Sri Lanka, and this is kind of like part of the culture of a religion. And this monastery has started a new tradition that's very, very heavily influenced by the Thai tradition. And I know this because I'm from the Thai tradition, and I know how they were influenced, and I know what parts of their tradition come from the Thai tradition. And a lot of them do too. But every time I go to this monastery, they're attacking the Thai tradition. And I was like, where is this coming from? Like, you know where you're getting your traditions from. Like, you know where this came from. But this is actually the ruthless nature of the competition between religions in India. And it's because of this ruthless competition, in part, that Buddhism was almost completely wiped out. There's kind of like no memory of it for a long time. And actually, if you still go to the Buddhist holy sites today, I remember I went to visit these, that there was all this music playing. And I asked the person who took me, I was like, why is there pop music playing at every Buddhist holy site? Has anybody been there? Like almost every Buddhist holy site you go to, there's like this pop music playing. And I was like, why are they loud speaking pop music into these holy sites? And he's like, that's not pop music, that's Hindu devotional songs. And my friend was a Brahmin from the south of India whose family was Advaita Vedanta. So the bitterness of these debates continue on. So Adi Shankara succeeded in uniting Hinduism mainly and established this doctrine of Advaita Vedanta, which came largely from Buddhism. But he distinguished it. He argued against Buddhism and so made Hinduism a little bit separate. But of course, in the minds of lay people, this doesn't really matter, right? Kind of, they're not going to get into all these really abstruse philosophical doctrines. At the same time, what was happening in Buddhism was that it was developing even further. So same time Adi Shankara and Advaita Vedanta came around, what was happening at that time was the kings in India, they were starting to get more and more broken apart. So in Ashoka's time, it was very, very powerful. All of India was ruled by one king. As Indian history developed, it got more and more fragmented. And actually what happened by this time was the kings were just like local kings, and they weren't even usually nobles. They weren't coming from the Khattiya class. They were sometimes these servants or like or people in the lower classes. So what they started to do was they started to adopt the doctrines of these kind of like magicians and wizards who were on the fringes of society. And these magicians and wizards were called siddhas. Because if you're a king, you need legitimacy to be a king. So what these siddhas did, they were kind of really controversial. They would do some of the most like disgusting things. I won't list what they did, but they'd be disgusting even for like a normal person. And they said that in doing these things, they were tapping into this kind of power. So these new kings who were coming up locally, they supported these siddhas, and they were from the lower caste, so they didn't need the Brahmin stuff. They said, we're getting our power from this new magic that these siddhas are doing. So some of the rituals would involve some gross stuff and some sexual stuff, these siddhas. And Buddhism and Hinduism had to respond to this competition. Now, another important thing that had happened in India was that Buddhism stopped being kind of centered around like small temples or monasteries dotted throughout the countryside, and it started to get collected more and more and more in these humongous universities. So the most famous of these universities is called Nalanda University. That university was founded about 2nd century CE, but it started to grow. And what they did in these universities was they collected all these like philosophies that were floating around, and they developed them further. So a lot of what we think about Mahayana, a lot of what we're going to be talking about what becomes Vajrayana, was developed and refined in these universities. That's what they did. They came up with these doctrines, and if you ever try to read these doctrines, sometimes like they're like a counterpoint on top of a counterpoint on top of a counterpoint. And like even as a monk, me going through and trying to study this, I was like, oh, I can't read it. I don't know where this is coming from. It's too intense. So you can imagine what it's like for the lay people. So Buddhism, the people at the forefront of Buddhism were stopping to be the monks who were locally going for pindapata, locally practicing meditation, locally involved with the lay people. They started to be these professors at universities who were coming up with doctrines that came further and further away from the Buddhist teachings. So this third development, they originally called it kind of mantrayana. These kind of siddhas would use mantras, and then they started to do these rituals in which they would reenact like sexual things. And this reenactment was supposed to give them the power of whatever god they were channeling. So in Hinduism, it became like Shiva. And in Buddhism, it became Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. So you ended up with these rituals where monks would imagine or enact themselves in a sexual act or another transgressive act, in imagining Buddhas and their consorts, and this was supposed to give them a shortcut to enlightenment. So you have this kind of development where, okay, now you know emptiness is the nature of reality, so you can break the precepts according to skillful means. The next development on top of that was, okay, now you know emptiness is the nature of reality. If you do a ritual, you can access enlightenment without putting the causes into place. You just get the effect. So this new school was called the effect school as opposed to the cause school. You just do the ritual, then you get the effect right away. And these rituals, as I mentioned, were pretty intense. So what was happening with Buddhism, it was getting more and more divorced from the laity, more and more divorced from morality, more and more involved in speculation about what was going on in the outside world, and then a calamity hit. So about 600 AD in Arabia, a man named Muhammad started to hear voices, get visions from God, and he started a religion which eventually became known as Islam. And in the outset of Islam, by the way, before I talk about Islam, I should say that my father is Muslim, and actually my middle name is the name of the first caliph who ruled all of Islam. But if we're going to examine the historical record, then we have to do so a little bit clear-eyed to get the actual causes and effects that affect history. So if we look at what happened historically with Islam, actually initially Muhammad spread Islam through violent conquest of neighboring tribes, and neighboring tribes were given an ultimatum. Either you convert to Islam or you get killed. Actually, this really was, by and large, the way that it was spread. And there was a lot of other things that went with that. You got immunity if you were a follower of Muhammad and you killed or enslaved or raped other people, no problem according to God. You could not kill or enslave or rape fellow Muslims. So there was this huge divide between who was a Muslim and who wasn't. And a big incentive if you're in Arabia to getting attacked if you just convert, because nobody's going to slaughter you and nobody's going to steal your stuff. So Islam in its very earliest phase spread in this means. And of course, this is not all there is to Islam. It's, there are very good Muslims and there are mystical aspects of Islam, but in its earliest phase, this was actually how it spread. And it spread throughout Asia, throughout Central Asia, and came to the Turks. The Turks ended up being this very fanatical group, and they decided they were going to go and conquer India. India had these legendary riches. Now, the place where Nalanda was located was controlled by a dynasty called the Pala dynasty. Now, this Pala dynasty was relatively strong, but in about the 12th, they were holding the Turks at bay, but in about the 12th or 13th century, they grew weak. And because of their weakness, they fragmented into all these different states. And this gave the Turks an opportunity to come into India. When they came into India, they ruthlessly slaughtered and basically completely destroyed Buddhism. And if anybody has ever read any of the teachings on what you should do to idols in the Quran, the Arabic word for idol is Bud. It comes from Buddhism. Because when the Turks came to India, what did they see? So many Buddha statues. So their attack on Indian religion was probably centered on Buddhism, and it was extremely ruthless. It's basically genocide. In the earliest surahs in the Quran, essentially religious genocide is recommended. These are historical facts, unfortunately, and facts about religion which are possible for anybody to look up. So I don't want to say those to be controversial or to put down Muslims, because actually my father is a Muslim and I have a Muslim name. And there are very, very good Muslims, but this is a historical fact about the way it spread in the beginning of its time. So because of this ruthless conquest, actually, this was the death blow to Buddhism in the land of its home, in India. It had grown so separated from the laity, it had grown so dependent on these abstruse doctrines, and it had been pushed to the margins by a revitalized Hinduism led by Adi Shankara that ironically came from Buddhism. Came from these very doctrines that the Buddhists created by speculating about things that the Buddha said should be put aside. By the way, there's sutras in which the Buddha says there's things that you shouldn't think about or shouldn't talk about because they lead to a wilderness of views, they lead to a thicket of views. One of them is the world eternal? Is it not eternal? Does the Tathagata exist after death? Does it not exist after death? And what kind of views have we been talking about for the last 30, 40 minutes? Views about whether the world is eternal or not eternal. Views about whether the Tathagata exists after death, or or does not exist after death. And so it was the fault of the monks It was the fault of the Buddhists that they went down this path that the Buddha said not to go down. And ironically, it was this path that led to a resurgent Hinduism that allowed Buddhism to be defeated on this very doctrine of no self. Ironically, it was this path that caused Buddhism to become concentrated in universities, such that even me as a monk, I find their doctrines hard to understand. I don't want to listen. What does this have to do with me? How many, you kind of go through these doctrines. Oh, this hurts my head. So you can imagine the regular layperson. It was this path that led these doctrines to become concentrated in universities. And when they were concentrated in universities, when they were attacked by the invading Turks, Buddhism was wiped out. So one of the other sleights of hand that Hinduism did was they made Buddha into an avatar of Vishnu. So the few Buddhist lay people that were remaining around these areas, they basically just became like part of they became part of Hinduism and adopted Buddha as an avatar of Vishnu. And honestly, it's probably not that far of a stretch when you see how far the doctrines of Buddhism had gone from the suffering that was present in people's lives. But the story doesn't end there, fortunately. Of course, as we all know, Buddhism came back to India, but the story takes a more interesting twist. So in the late 19th century, there was a Parliament of World Religions. And in this Parliament of World Religions, there were representatives from Buddhism, representatives from Hinduism, representatives from all religions, with the noble aim, of course, of peace and harmony. And by all accounts, it was a very successful, it seems, parliament. It's still remembered to today. One of the speakers at the Parliament of World Religion was a man named Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda was a proponent of Advaita Vedanta. There was also Buddhists there as well. But perhaps more impactful for the way that we understand Buddhism today was that also in the late 19th century in India, a man was born who, by all accounts it seems, was a genuinely spiritual man, genuinely humble man, and an excellent meditator, and his name was Ramana Maharshi. So Ramana Maharshi, he had this inclination to meditate when he was young. He would enter into these very, very deep states of samadhi. And one day came when he got really, really sick. And so he entered into a state of samadhi or so, and he noticed that his body was not self, but he noticed this small current. So he came to the idea, that current is me. And from there, he decided to give up his family, and he went down to some caves in South India in an area which is kind of difficult. I think it's called Tiruvannamalai. Yes, thank you. So he went down there, and he stayed in caves for quite some time, just meditating. And he would go into deep jhanas for days at a time, and his body would be neglected, and devotees would come to offer him food. So he's basically viewed as the last of India's superheroes. I mean, India has these superheroes. They've got the Buddha, they've got Nagarjuna, Adi Shankara, They have these people who are just head and shoulders spiritually above everybody else. And Ramana Maharshi is viewed as the last. He died in about 1950, but the way that he taught was that basically Brahman is the ultimate reality, and we can recognize our inner divinity merging with this ultimate reality more or less. He used these kind of questioning methods to bring a person's mind to a state where they could experience this ultimate reality. So in other words, his teachings were very, very close to Advaita Vedanta. Now, in the 1960s in the United States, a movement started which came to be known as the hippie movement. So I'm getting a question. Oh yeah. So a movement started which came to be known as the hippie movement. And these hippies, kind of like the Samana movement, they rejected the norms of their culture, and they started looking basically everywhere else, and they started doing drugs and all kinds of things, and they got interested in Hinduism. And a lot of these hippies coming from the United States or other Western countries went to India. And when they went to India, what did they encounter? They encountered Advaita Vedanta in the form of Ramana Maharshi's teachings. Some of these people who encountered Ramana Maharshi's teachings in this way went to Thailand, went to other Buddhist countries, and later ordained as Buddhist monks. Other of them disrobed or went back to the West, but actually eventually became Buddhists. And the way in which they interpreted Buddhism was actually through this lens of Advaita Vedanta. And one of the really interesting things is that on some monks' walls, you have all these pictures of monk, 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 monk. One of the pictures on their walls is Ramana Maharshi. It's not just one, there's a lot of monks like that. They've got photos of Ramana Maharshi on their wall. Not that he was a very spiritual person, and by all accounts a genuine person, but there's a very funny irony here, in that Ramana Maharshi's teachings seem to be influenced by Advaita Vedanta, which destroyed Buddhism, helped to destroy Buddhism in India, and Advaita Vedanta was influenced by Buddhism. So if these teachings, what we often hear in Buddhist circles these days sometimes is you should just be the knowing. Just be the knowing, and that it comes across like that's all you have to do to eliminate your defilements. If you got a defilement, just watch it. Eventually the defilement will fall away. What remains is often not spoken of, but is implied as being nibbana. Now, if this sounds like something familiar, it is. It comes from Buddhism, but not the Buddhism that's in the Pali Canon. It comes from a Buddhism that was developed later and then turned into something that would eventually defeat itself. So it's very ironic that it's come full circle and is now the way that Buddhism is interpreted quite often. So what did the Buddha teach about this? First of all, this awareness that comes when we just watch and something falls away is not nibbana. That is what we call vijnana khandha in the early Theravada texts. The Buddha describes it as a calamity. He describes it as alien. He describes it as a danger. So just thinking that whatever we watch will fall away, we're in the danger of attaching to something that the Buddha describes as a calamity. It's vijnana khandha. It should be investigated for the sake of letting go. Another aspect of this is that in this just watching, the Buddha has given so many strategies for eliminating defilements. If all there is to it is just watching, what happens to the rest of the canon? Actually, the way that our defilements is eliminated requires an immense amount of skill. It requires the development of the Noble Eightfold Path in all of the facets that the Buddha laid it out. It requires the development of jhanas. It requires the development of insight. It requires the development of the skill that allows one to defeat one's own defilements and see what one was doing to cause oneself to suffer. So it's a world apart from these teachings. It's something very, very different. And actually, this was something that I found when I got into a conversation with somebody about Advaita Vedanta on a podcast, actually. And what he said was, yeah, I mean, Advaita Vedanta actually has its good points. So by the way, this is not a wholesale criticism or wholesale rejection of these methods. They do have their good points, and they do have their uses. And it's a lot better than being an immoral person to be a moral Advaita Vedantin, right? I mean, it's much better. So there's a continuum to these things, but there's also dangers. So what he said about Advaita Vedanta and his experience in it was, the thing about this is that there's no path. He said, you just get told all these buzzwords, and those buzzwords are supposed to bring you back to awareness. Because one of the reasons for this is that there was a purpose for the development of Advaita Vedanta, and its development was not for the sake of liberation. It was developed in order to unify Hinduism and in part to destroy Buddhism. This is part of the real reasons for which it was developed. And that is why there is not this very elaborate laying out of a path in the same way that there is in the teachings of the original Buddha. So these are differences. We've talked about similarities. And of course, I realize some of these things will be controversial, but I recommend people to investigate them for themselves, to form their own opinions. Now, the last thing that we're going to talk about here today, which relates to the way that the Theravada went, is the doctrine of no self. So we remember in this very early Abhidhamma, they came up with this doctrine that there is no self. There is no self, and because there's no self, there's nothing underlying experience. All there is these momentary cetasikas or whatever it might be. And because of that, Adi Shankara was able to say, what about memory? Actually, there's many arguments you can posit against this. So what was the Buddha saying about self and not self? When we look in the canon to see what the Buddha says about not self, what we see is that the Buddha in the main describes it as an activity. So actually, one of the wrong views you can come to if you start thinking about who am I? What am I? Where do I come from? You start thinking about these things, there's different wrong views you can come to. One of them is I have a self. Another one is I have no self. That's very funny. That's listed in the canon. You start thinking, who am I? What am I? Where did this being come from? You start to think, I've got a self. Or you start to think, I have no self. So what did the Buddha mean when he taught about anatta? Because he says, sabbe dhamma anatta, which means all dhammas are not self. So when we look in the canon, what we see is the Buddha teaching about self as an activity. In other words, self is something that we do. He calls it's a process that he calls ahankara mamankara, which means I-making and my-making. And this process, the way that it proceeds, is really interesting. It links up with all the other Buddhist teachings. There's no discrepancy there. And Another thing that the Buddha says is if there's a self, there has to be what belongs to a self. In other words, if you've got a self, there has to be some characteristics to it, or there has to be something that you think it owns. You have a conception, in other words. You're thinking about an idea of what your self is. Because you've got this idea of what your self is, you will not be able to go beyond it if you think it's really you, if you think it's really great. And the way that the Buddha describes this is independent origination. We have contact. From the contact, we have feeling. From the feeling, we have craving. From the craving, we have clinging. And from the clinging, we have becoming. In other words, we encounter things in our life. We like them or we don't. If we like them, they become a part of who we are. I'm a person with this job. I'm a person, with this family background. I'm a person from this country. We create our self. Our self is an activity called ahankara mamankara. Now what the Buddha says about the creation of the self and these eternalist views, he says, the Tathagata basically knows how far these go. And knowing them, he basically knows what the limit is, and he knows the further escape beyond them. So what we see is that the Buddha is not pointing in his teaching about self and not self to an ultimate reality. What he's pointing back to is us. He's pointing back to our own experience. He's pointing back to the way in which we construct the world that we live in, and whether we construct a world that's good or not is what causes us to suffer. And in fact, the fact that we construct a world at all causes us to suffer. Because whatever world we construct, we cannot keep it that way. So the Buddha's teachings in the original canon point one way, back to ourself, back to the ways in which we cause our own suffering or we cause our own happiness. So ultimately, this tipping point started in Indian Buddhist history that led to its vanquishment when people started looking for the answers to the cause of suffering or looking to the answers for what's really important outside of themselves. Looking for an ultimate reality, looking for a God, looking for magic rituals, when the answer that they're looking for is always right here. It's not that far away. So the Buddha has said that the Dhamma does not disappear all at once like the sinking of a ship. And he's also said that the Dhamma doesn't disappear through an attack, basically. He says it disappears through worthless men who arise right here, which means in the Buddha's dispensation. So the lessons that we can take forward for the future, knowing what happened in Buddhist history, is to know where to look as Buddhists. There's no need to memorize the doctrines of 100 different schools to find what we're looking for. To find what we're looking for, we can look in a very simple place. What it is that we're doing to cause ourselves to suffer. The way in which we build our world of experience is the way in which we create ourselves. And that self that we create is not us. As to what lies beyond it, that can't be described. It can only be experienced, and it should be experienced by those who practice. Okay, so I think that leave that for the talk. And that's all for the doctrines. I don't know if people's heads are full of philosophy. But if there's any questions, then I can take questions, yeah.
I think
Oh, sorry, Bharat was going to adjudicate, right? Yeah.
I've been reading a bit about Sankaya by Kapila, I think is the correct pronunciation.
Mm-hmm.
He goes up to 23 chapters. So he goes up to Buddhi, but he goes up the five senses, the five hearing, sight, speech, feeling. As Sankaya, have you had any experience with Sankaya and how that goes into Buddhism?
Samkhya, no. I mean, just researching this was a lot for me. So, Hinduism in India has a history that's longer than Buddhism. I mean, although, as we've seen, it's pretty intertwined. Actually, I don't know directly Samkhya, how it relates, but I think Samkhya was around in the Buddhist time, because there's some people who were,
500 BC.
there were Samkhya people who came to talk to the Buddha, and they wanted to find out his take on Samkhya. And usually at the end of each sutta, it says, and the lay people of the monks were satisfied and delighted in the Buddha's words. In this one, the Samkhya people wanted to find out the Buddhist take, I think, on it's like something like what the ground of all being was. And instead of telling them, he goes through this list, which basically points them in a totally different direction. And at the end of the sutta, it says, and they were not satisfied and did not delight in the Buddha's words. It's like the only sutta which says that. So apparently Samkhya was around before, but as for its relationship with Buddhism or how they were cross-influenced in later centuries, I can't say. I didn't research it very much at all.
Just to add a bit to that,
Yeah.
it's an atheistic philosophy, but it does have the distinction between the self and a higher self, similar to the Pugala Vadans
Right.
within the Stavri Vadans.
Right, yeah.
Theravadins.
Yeah.
So, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. But I would like to ask a few questions to Bhante here.
Oh.
So you didn't really touch upon Tibetan side of things, and they were kind of in their own geographical location, kind of secluded from most of India. You know, they're known to be the preservers of Mahayana Buddhism. And how did they actually influence any debates, or is there any crossover between Tibetans and say, for example, the Advaita people?
Well, basically Tibetan Buddhism comes from India. So the developments that we talked about at the end of the talk, the mantrayana and these rituals, those developments occurred in Nalanda University. So actually a lot of the stories that we have about these siddhas, I mean, I used to read some of these stories, you know, some of the things that they did, I mean, even reading them then, I was like, oh. So the Tibetans have essentially preserved the latest form of the Buddhist tradition coming from Nalanda University. And by the way, the Dalai Lama is really excellent. I mean, his book was the first book on Buddhism I read. But in terms of the theories, that's where it comes from. They've adopted most of this very late form Buddhism. And actually in their canon, the Kangyur, there isn't a complete representation of the early suttas. There's also some serious things that they say about hanging out with Hinayanists. So they come from Nalanda. That's where they come from. They weren't big influencers in this Advaita debate. That happened in India. And it was when Buddhism got wiped out of India that Tibetan Buddhism, Buddhism in Southeast Asia, and Buddhism in China, East Asia, they were geographically separated for about 1,000 years. So it's at that point that they developed their own really unique and distinct flavors and distinct doctrines. They became separated for so long.
Any influence with respect to the Sri Lankan history side of things?
From Advaita?
Yeah, from Advaita, or these things were happening in South India, right? Adi Shankara was born in Kerala or Tamil Nadu,
Right.
around that region.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about in your earlier talk, there were a group of monks, 60 monks, who went to the other shore and they preserved whatever they need to preserve, and they came back.
Uh-huh.
So that was still within the 500 years of flourishing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, that happened in when was that? The 1st century BC. The Gaudapadiya-karika, this book that basically lifted all these doctrines from Buddhism, that was in the 5th century AD.
Right.
So there would be no overlap with Advaita Vedanta.
So that was the time when Visuddhimagga was being written in Sri Lanka.
No, the Visuddhimagga was being written in Sri Lanka in the 4th century AD.
4th century, okay.
So what we see in Sri Lanka is essentially part of that sociological phenomenon that we were talking about, where you take a religion from the place of its origin and put it in a new culture. It becomes more conservative than the religion was in the culture that gave birth to it.
Right.
So they seem to have been much more reluctant to develop new Buddhist doctrines than they were in India. Obviously, they weren't reluctant at all in India. They just just went for it.
Free-spirited, yeah? So there's a question in the chat, Bhante.
Mhm.
The question is, did the destruction of the giant Buddha statue in Afghanistan relate to the attempt to destroy Buddhism? This happened much later on? Or?
The destruction of the Bamiyan statues, I think, occurred in, that occurred like 20 years ago, or 10 years ago, something? Not long ago, right? So,
18, 20 years ago, by Mullah Omar.
right, so not long ago it happened. And basically, I mean, I'd encourage people to go and look into the Quran themselves, and you'll find the reasons why this happened. I mean, the instructions to do that are within the Quran. So basically, you're supposed to destroy idols. So that's where it came from. It didn't come from the movement of the Turks. It came from the earliest strata of instructions in Islam. So it's there. It's written into the earliest books. Although again, I have to mention, I don't want to be apologizing too much or anything. But again, this does not apply obviously to all Muslims. But the Muslims who do take that on, they're getting it from the Quran. It's not an extremist view. It comes from Muhammad. It comes from his actions. It comes from what's written in the Quran. Yeah.
Well, Buddhists and Hindus aren't considered people of the book.
Mhm.
The people of the book are Jews, Christians, and Muslims.
Uh-huh.
And you're not supposed to have idols.
Right.
But you know, what's an idol? An idol's a lens to somewhere.
Mhm.
But the Muslims don't see it that way. And yet they go, once in their life, they walk around this square in Mecca, and some people say, well, isn't the Kaaba an idol? What's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to get into like, I don't want to go down the track of getting into like, should Muslims do this or that? I only mentioned it, and I mentioned it with some reluctance because it's an inescapable historical fact of the destruction of Buddhism in India, and unfortunately, many people actually don't know the clear reasons for that and where they come from. They come from the Quran. They come from the earliest strata of the Muslim teaching. They come from the example that Muhammad set. So I don't want to get in there and like be insulting all Muslims or all their practices, but the destruction of Buddhism comes from that movement. So I think I'll just leave it at that because yeah.
So they came in and they destroyed and they left. Did they not
No.
No.
Islam there?
Oh yeah. Well, that's where the Taj Mahal comes from, right? I mean, they ruled over India for quite a long time. I think until the 17th century. Then I think the British kicked them out. So
The influence of Islam is not significant.
It is.
yeah, that's why you have the divide between Pakistan and India. It happened because when the British left, then these unresolved tensions were still there. But anyways.
So, Bhante, a question or something along the lines is the Nalanda University, when it was destroyed, burned for months.
Right.
And I've been to Qutb Minar, which is like this huge historical thing, and just next to it is a temple, a Hindu temple. And you can actually see that they've systematically destroyed every carving.
Yeah. If you go to India, you see that. Yeah.
So, what is the what are the insights that we can get from history moving forwards, and where are we now in this?
Well, I think the most important insight we can get is to be able to separate what is the Buddhist teaching from what isn't. And one of the biggest dangers, which has been rebutted very strongly by Ajahn Ṭhānissaro, but is very rarely rebutted by others, is that this idea that the Buddha taught that you should just go back to awareness, and if you go back to awareness and observe objects that are not your awareness and watch them fall away, then that is enough to attain Nibbana. So we've gone through where that comes from now and some of its limitations. And so I think that's something that should be considered for people who do want to practice for the sake of Nibbana. It's not to say that that practice is bad in every respect, but it's at best a very small facet of a huge body of teachings and techniques on how to achieve the goal. It should be regarded in that way. Yeah.
Bhante, just a comment on that though.
Mhm.
It seems more like a modern Vipassana movement / technique that sort of instruction comes from more than Advaita, Vedanta. Or is it possibly how you talked about that the new teachers that are currently teaching in the West were practicing a part of that?
Right. So, I mean, one of the etiquettes of being a Buddhist monk and teaching is that, you don't ever mention the names of people who do this. So it's enough to say that some of those Vipassana teachers who started the Vipassana movement have Ramana Maharshi on their wall, probably. So I don't know, especially some of the more influential ones. I don't think the Goenka Vipassana movements are like that. Although I can't say, you would know. So I can't say everything for sure, but it is a significant strand. Coming from Ramana Maharshi, coming from Advaita Vedanta, that is a significant influence in the way that Buddhism is interpreted. Whether there are other influences that are similar, I can't say. It took me like 2 weeks of studying almost it's like studying nonstop just to find this out. Yeah.
Well, the video editors can edit my comment out. I think the Goenka technique lends itself more to the burning of defilements through sitting through pain. So it's another popular religion out there that advocates that.
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Without putting names.
Sorry. how do we know what is the right technique to do Nibbana? Because how do we know who has even done it? You know, how do we know this is wrong, that's right, that's wrong? And like,
Yeah, well, the way...
people who have achieved Nibbana and then like say, oh, this is the only way, or there could be multiple ways to Nibbana.
Yes, of course, there's multiple ways to Nibbana. I mean, you can say there's only one...
Shortcut, maybe that's true.
No. Well, you can say there's only one way. The only way is the Noble Eightfold Path. But as far as who judges if one is progressing on the path to Nibbana, the most important judge is the person who's practicing. And that's why the Buddha said that it's to be known individually by the wise. I mean, there are people who've attained Nibbana. They're alive today. That's one of the really amazing things about being alive in this era. However, if you go and stay with somebody who's attained Nibbana, and they're a very good teacher, they don't go and tell you, okay, first you do this. This is the only way to Nibbana. There's a really famous story about Longta Mahabua where a Westerner comes to see him, and he asks him, he's like, what's the way to attain Nibbana? And he'd been reading about all these kind of like methods that he should do. And Longta Mahabua was the most famous arahant in modern Thailand. So what he said was, I don't know how you're going to attain Nibbana. What he said was, I know how I attained it. He said, I advise you to keep trying different methods, and when you find something that works, keep doing it. And if you find something that doesn't work, then stop doing it. So although the principles behind it are very simple, how to practice, the actual doing of it is difficult because it links up with things that we don't like to let go. It links up with bad habits we have to stop. It links up with things that people like to consume that they don't like to let go of. That's why it's hard.
So that method you're saying, like just watching your awareness and defilements falling away, like people have tried and said, okay, that's not leading to Nibbana.
No, the larger danger is that people think they have achieved Nibbana. That happens more often. Like people think that they've had this experience of awareness, and now they've achieved Nibbana. And they haven't. So that's the bigger danger. You might not find that out for a long time, right? You might die with that idea. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, go on. Bhante, fantastic talk. I've always found it difficult as a concept to reconcile anatta with the continuity of consciousness that's needed for things like memory.
Right.
And even also, children that seem to recall very unique events that then can be historically verified and are suggested to represent past life memories.
Right.
Because one would think there has to be some form of continuity, some entity, some energy that needs to continue on. Obviously, I know that there isn't. That's sort of the fundamental aspect of Buddhism. How do you, you sort of mentioned that Adi Shankar went around debating Buddhists and sort of used that as obviously something to defeat Buddhism.
Yeah.
What is how as Theravada Buddhists should we conceptualize that notion?
The notion of what it is that's behind experience that allows for a continuity of memory, or
Yes.
So there's certain things that the Buddha said should be put aside.
Okay. Yeah.
So it sounds like a dodge, but what we've been going through this whole history is people trying to answer these questions
Yes.
and getting further and further and further away from the path to Nibbana.
Yes.
There was one time I started having kind of like questions about like a Nibbana, and this teacher, he told me the story about a teacher of his. And so what he said was, yes, when when Ajahn so-and-so, when he achieved Nibbana, when he became an arahant, he said, when you achieve Nibbana, you don't care if there's a self there or not. You don't care about all these things. It's the end of your goals.
Right.
So thinking about things that the Buddha has not described in this way is a thorn in the path. The important thing to know is that he did not say that there's no self and there's nothing behind experience. That is not something that he said.
Okay.
That's a really important point.
Right.
So what...
Even we use this term anatta, which implies no self.
Mhm. It doesn't imply no self. Anatta can also be taken to be not self. In other words, it's a perception you apply to the things which you believe are yours, and it causes you to let go of them.
Right.
And that goes really extreme. So the Buddha says that, there's nothing, that basically the only way you can conceive of anything or talk of anything is if something is within the all. What's within the all is the six senses. But he does describe things that are outside of the all. He describes nibbana. That's the only thing outside of the all. But there's a very cryptic passage in the canon which is quite controversial. And it's about a type of consciousness called anidasana vijnana. So it appears twice in the canon. And at one point in the canon, both of the times the Buddha is rebuking Brahmins. And basically he takes a stand on something that is more refined than the Brahmins. He disappears from them, or something like, or at one time at least. The other time is not like that. He disappears from them, and they can't see him. Then he talks about anidasana vijnana, and he says, anidasana vijnana. He says, it's not known through the earthness of earth, the fieriness of fire, the wateriness of water, the airiness of air, or the allness of the all. He talks about a type of consciousness that is not known through the allness of the all. One of the really interesting things is that they have a sutta in which it gives the different epithets for nibbana. And by the way, I encourage people, it's good to look at the Pali, because actually the views of a monk come into their translations. It's almost impossible not to put them in there, because you want to give the most accurate view, and it's what you think, right? So there's different words that they give as synonyms for nibbana. Nibbana is one. Another one's like the harbor, the island. One of them is anidasana. So the translators who translate that, they sometimes translate the synonym in that list different from the type of consciousness in that sutta. It's the same word. So as far as how that might link up with our waking state or our memory between rebirth, the Buddha doesn't say, and you can see where it leads. But it's clear that he does describe the possibility that that nibbana could be a type of consciousness that is not known through the allness of the all. In other words, you don't experience it unless you attain nibbana. Yeah.
I actually asked this question to Bandi Sujato before.
Uh-huh.
He said memory and like past life memories and all that is part of consciousness. It's what it carries forward. One a part of. I think if that's what I remember from his answer. I may be wrong. But
I guess,
I've asked that.
I mean, is the point in the end, and I think I have heard it described this way, is to really not to fixate on that kind of question, though our mind goes there, because it really is not actually useful
Right.
for getting rid of our defilements and attaining it.
Right. That's right.
Basically,
That's right.
what it boils down to.
That's what it boils down
If
to.
you're sitting with Adi Shankar, today,
Mhm.
and he's telling you, what is memory? How do Buddhists accept memory
Uh-huh.
or past lives or these things, despite the evidence for it?
Uh-huh. Well,
Yes, you would respond
don't-
by saying there is no point.
Yeah, you don't. The Buddha did not recommend engaging in those type of debates.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
He spoke very strongly against debating that way. So I mean, you can see where that led to, right?
Yes.
So actually, this answer about what it is that carries on beyond consciousness, whatever you say about that, it's not coming from the suttas.
Yes.
It's an answer that somebody's come up with. I'm not going to say whether it's right or wrong, but you can see where it leads, right?
Yes.
That's why history is interesting, is important. Yeah, can lead. Yeah.
What was your translation for Adinasa?
Anidasana.
Yeah.
Well, I often follow Ajahn Ṭhānissaro. Translations like consciousness without surface, surfaceless consciousness.
Mind like fire unbound.
Yeah, The Mind Like Fire Unbound is a book where he goes through the whole metaphor of fire that the Buddha gives and explains why it's not annihilation. So, yeah, anidasana is, you can translate it as like surfacelessness. So basically, it occurs in two places in the canon. The one that I just described, the Buddha talks about it as being beyond the allness of the all. In the other one, the Buddha describes that the four elements have no footing. They don't stick. So the four elements have no footing in anidasana vijnana. Whereas a regular type of consciousness, to even have that consciousness, you have to have a connection with one of the four elements, something outside, right? That's how consciousness comes about. But these four elements have no footing in anidasana vijnana. They don't stick to it. He gives other metaphors like that in the canon too, but so that's why surfacelessness can be a reasonable translation.
It would have been very interesting if he had said has no footing in all six elements, not just the four, including space and consciousness itself.
Yeah, well, you can, he says the allness of the all, right? Which includes everything in samsara. Yeah.
So, but the word itself, darshana, actually means just to see. Ani darshana is not being able to see it.
Yeah, I think to get into the Pali, we would have to, check it out, because some of the ways that Pali words use, there can be a tendency to look back to the Sanskrit roots in order to translate Pali. But like any language, I mean, the English words that we use right now, sometimes some of them come from like German, and they mean a completely different thing than their German root. So in order to find out what the word means, you actually have to take that word and look at it in the context which it's used in that language, like in that, that's where you get the meaning.
Yeah. So one more question from me.
Yeah.
Bhante, I just wanted to ask, there was one time I spoke to a teacher who was teaching the awareness meditation,
Mm-hmm.
and she pointed to the book by Ajahn Full, Awareness Itself,
Uh-huh.
as being like legitimizing that aspect of meditation. I don't know whether you're familiar with the contents of that book or...
Right. Well, you've got to look at the teachings he gives at the very end of the book, right? So, I mean, one of the things is that one of the progressions of a monk's practice that some ajahns describe is that basically they go through and they let go of the grosser elements through the usual ways they practice, like especially the body, through a subhakamatana. Once you've let go of your attachment to the body, all that remains are the mental khandhas, like perception and feeling and consciousness. It's actually one of the last ones. So it's when you've let go of all these other things that you turn your attention to look at the flaws in consciousness. Up until that time, you can use consciousness to a certain extent.
Yeah,
It's when you get to the very end of the path, you've got to let go of the raft. So then you turn this form of investigation to see that even consciousness is not self. Even that is suffering, right? So it's at that point that you go beyond consciousness, you go beyond the all. And what's left after that, you can't describe. So in Ajahn Fum's book, he is not legitimizing this just go back to awareness. It actually goes much deeper than that. Yeah.
We have a question online. Kusal, you have your hand raised. You want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, we got that.
Thank you. Sir Bhante, I have a question. First of all, thanks for your time
Sure.
and for all the valuable teachings.
Mm-hmm.
The question, since you mentioned Anidasana Vijnana,
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering, there's a term in Satipatthana Sutta, Anisito Viharati Nacha Loke Upadhyati, something like that. So this state, is it something relates to Anidasana Vijnana?
I have to admit, right, I'm not a Pali expert, right? So usually when I translate Pali texts, I break all the words up and then I translate each word one by one. It takes a really long time. So like people who are expert Pali monks, they can just listen to a sentence like that and they'll know right away what's going on. But I'm not like that. So actually, I don't even know what that sentence means at all, actually, in Pali. I'd have to see the English translation. Then I'd have to look at the Pali translation for that particular word. So if you send it to me through WhatsApp, I'll take a look and we can chat about it more.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah.
I will do that. Thanks so much.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a fun comment saying, can we have 30 more minutes with Bhante? We're nearing the end of the session. Bhante, would you like to share anything more, like a wrap-up message?
No.
Great. So would you like to share merits before we close out the show?
Oh, okay. I'll see how my voice holds up. So please forgive me if my voice breaks because Yatha varivaha pura paripuranti sakarang eva meva etodinang petanang upakapati ichitang patitang tumhang kipameva samichatu sabe parentu sankapa Chanto panaraso yetta manijotiraso yetta sambityo vivachantu sammarogo vinasatu mate pavatvanterayo sukidika yuko bhava abhivatana silisa nichang udhapachaino chattaro dhammavatanti Ayuvanno sukhang balang bhavatu samba mangalang Rakhantu Samba Devata Samba Buddha Nupavena Sada Soti Bhavantu Te Bhavatu Samba Mangalang Rakhantu Samba Devata Samba Dhamma Nupavena Sada Soti Bhavantu Te Bhavatu Samba Mangalang Rakhantu Samba Devata Samba Sankha Nupavena Sada Soti Bhavantu Te.
Thank you so much, Bhante. It's been a fabulous, fantastic talk again. Deep dive into the history.
It's been great to meet with people, and I'm glad everybody stayed awake through the philosophy. I was really worried that I'd get some nodders or people running out of the door.
Yeah, I should have given you some water so that you could continue the session. But anyways, I think I will give it back to Sensei. Close the session.
Well, that's all. Thank you. All right, then. Thank you so much, Bhante Joe. Wow, I struggled to find an adjective to describe that talk, but well, very positive one.
Okay.
It was fabulous. It was like listening to a lecture on history. But it was really fascinating. So thank you so much once again, Bhante. So everybody, just before we finish the session tonight, at the beginning of the session, I mentioned that there's a few new events led by Bhante Joe that had not been announced. So I'm just going to make this announcement. First of all, this coming Friday, Bhante Joe will be meeting Bhante Sujato in Harris Park for Pindapata or Alms Round. So you're welcome to join, you're welcome to go to Harris Park to offer food if you would like to do so. But also, after that, Bhante Joe and Bhante Sujato and a few other people will be going on a coastal walk in Avalon, which is near Palm Beach in the northern beaches. And if anybody is able to drive and give some of us a lift, that would be greatly appreciated. We have possibly one or two cars, but it looks like we may actually need another car. So if anyone is able to do that, please let me know. I'm happy to give my number here. So just 1 second. Yeah, so I've just sent my number in the chat. So please contact me if anybody is able to provide a lift. And also on Saturday, Bhante Joe will be, we will be doing a forest walk in the Blue Gum Forest in Hornsby. All the information is already in the chats as well. So I've already mentioned this in the chat. So I believe that's from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock. We're going for a walk, and they will be doing some meditation, and there's going to be an informal chat with Bhante Joe. It is a beautiful forest, not far from Dhamma-Vinaya Buddhist Vihara in Hornsby. But also on Sunday evening, Bhante Joe will be leading another session at Dhamma-Vinaya Buddhist Vihara, also in Hornsby. So all the information is there. And of course, next week, Monday, is going to be the last session of the Object of Development course that Bhante has been running. And there's going to be one more talk by Bhante Joe next Wednesday. And the topic is, I can't remember right now, sorry, Bhante. But,
That's okay.
I think it's right to the end or something like that. That's what I remember. Something right to the end. The breakthrough of our practice or something like that. Don't quote me. But anyway, to find out more, just come to the talk next Wednesday then. Yeah, that's all from me. All the information is on the website. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Thank you,
Have a good night.
Bhante.
Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Bhante.
Thank you, Bhante.
Yeah, see you guys.
Thank you, Bhante. Good night.
Good night. I better shut this off too, huh?
Thank you for your help tonight too.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Turn this off. How do you stop this? Okay. That's good.